Finland has topped the World Happiness Report for 7 consecutive years. 7. Every year the headline comes out, the Nordic flags go up on social media, and some version of the same article gets written. Clean air, saunas, trust in institutions, a society that works. And for a long time, Finland genuinely was the envy of the developed world. But here is what the happiness index does not measure. It does not measure GDP per capita growth, which in real terms barely moved for over a decade after 2008. It does not measure an unemployment rate of 9.5% in 2025, the highest in the Nordic region by a wide margin. It does not measure a debt-to-GDP ratio that has climbed from around 33% before the financial crisis to over 88% today, with projections pointing toward 92% by 2027. The happiness score measures how people feel, not how the economy performs, and in Finland those two things have been quietly disconnected for years. There is a name for this kind of country. Economists call it a Potemkin economy. The facade is intact. The interior has been hollowing out. Finland kept its schools excellent, kept its public services running, and kept its citizens reasonably content. But it funded all of that increasingly on borrowed money, borrowed time, and the borrowed reputation of a golden era that ended in January 2007. That is the date everything changed, and almost nobody in the mainstream press will tell you why. To understand what Finland lost, you need to understand what Nokia actually was, not what people think it was, not a successful phone company. Nokia was the load-bearing pillar of an entire sovereign economy. At its peak, between 2000 and 2007, Nokia contributed 4 percentage points of Finnish GDP annually. That is not 4% of the tech sector. That is 4% of everything Finland produced. It accounted for 20% of the country's total exports and paid 23% of all Finnish corporate tax revenue. In the decade from 1998 to 2007, Nokia alone contributed roughly a quarter of Finland's total economic growth. Think about that for a second. One company, in a country of 5.5 million people, carrying a quarter of the national growth on its balance sheet. The supply chain multiplier made it even bigger than those numbers suggest. Hundreds of Finnish subcontractors, logistics firms, software vendors, and engineering consultancies existed primarily because Nokia needed them. When Nokia spent on R&D, which it did aggressively, accounting for roughly 1/3 of all Finnish R&D expenditure by 2008, entire research departments at Finnish universities were quietly subsidized by Nokia's growth trajectory. Finland did not just benefit from Nokia. Finland was, in a very real sense, built around Nokia. The welfare state, the world-class education system, and the generous public services, all of it was bankrolled in significant part by a single company's ability to sell mobile phones in volume to the rest of the world. If this video is useful to you, subscribe. This is the kind of story the mainstream economic press gets wrong, and we are only just getting started. And here is the thing nobody wants to say out loud. The moment that engine stopped, Finland had no replacement ready. Not even close. Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco on January 9th, 2007. He held up a small glass rectangle. He called it a revolutionary product. The crowd cheered. In Helsinki, nobody panicked. They should have. Nokia's worldwide market share peaked at 38.6% in 2008, the year after the iPhone launched. That sounds like strength. It was a lag effect. The iPhone had just entered the market. The real collapse was coming. By 2012, Nokia's smartphone share had been reduced to near irrelevance. The company sold its entire devices and services division to Microsoft in 2013 for 5.4 billion euros, a fraction of what it had been worth at its height. The speed was stunning. Finnish exports, heavily dominated by Nokia and its ecosystem, fell by roughly half in the years following 2007. The current account swung from a surplus of nearly 7% of GDP into a deficit. From 2008 to 2019, real Finnish per capita income did not grow. It actually declined slightly. An entire decade of economic output erased. The Finnish government had no contingency. There was no playbook for what happens when the company running a quarter of your economic growth simply stops growing. The Nokia-driven tech boom had also inflated wages and costs across the economy for years, leaving Finland with a competitiveness gap against Germany and Sweden that took years of painful pay restraint to even partially close. The golden goose did not just stop laying, it disappeared overnight, and the farmhouse it had been living in was extremely expensive to maintain. After Nokia collapsed, Finland needed a story, and for a while, it had a good one. Angry Birds launched in 2009. By 2012, it had been downloaded 2 billion times. Rovio was worth over $1 billion on paper. Then came Supercell, Clash of Clans, Clash Royale. By 2016, Supercell was sold to Tencent for $8.6 billion. The narrative was obvious. Finland did not need Nokia. Finland was a startup nation. The phoenix was rising from the ashes. Here is the part that narrative always leaves out. Supercell, at its peak creative period, employed around 300 people in Finland. In 2024, the entire Finnish gaming industry, across 270 studios, employed roughly 4,300 professionals total and generated about 2.85 billion euros in turnover. Those are real numbers. They are also completely incomparable to what Nokia represented. Nokia at its height directly employed over 22,000 people in Finland alone, with tens of thousands more in the supplier ecosystem. The company paid 23 cents of every euro in Finnish corporate tax. Software businesses are efficient by design. A small team can generate enormous revenue. That is their genius. It is also precisely why they cannot replace manufacturing employment at scale. €1 billion mobile game valuation does not create 40,000 stable middle-class engineering jobs. It creates 300 very well-paid ones and a lot of headlines. The startup myth gave Finland a decade of good press and a genuinely impressive innovation ecosystem. What it could not do was fill the structural hole that Nokia left in the labour market. That hole is still there, but something else was falling into it at the same time, something the world missed entirely. While the world was watching Nokia implode, Finland's second economic pillar was quietly crumbling in the background. The paper and pulp industry had been the backbone of the Finnish economy for generations. At its height, it accounted for around 20% of Finland's total exports, comparable to Nokia's peak share. Stora Enso, UPM and Metsä Group were industrial giants. The forests that covered 70% of Finland's landmass were not just scenery. They were a balance sheet. The shift to digital media hit hard. Global demand for printing and writing paper entered a structural decline that has never reversed. Finnish paper mills began closing. Stora Enso shuttered its Veitsiluoto plant, taking over 700 direct jobs with it. UPM closed multiple facilities. The closures were not cyclical, temporary pauses waiting for demand to return. They were permanent exits from a product category that the digital economy was making obsolete. The timing was devastating. Nokia's collapse gutted Finland's white-collar, tech-educated workforce. The paper industry's slow unwind hit a completely different demographic, the rural working class. Mill towns in central and northern Finland lost their primary employer. These were not workers who could pivot to app development or join a Helsinki startup. They were skilled industrial workers in regions with few alternative employers. Two separate economies were being hollowed out at the same time, affecting two completely different groups of Finnish workers in two completely different geographies. The government was dealing with both simultaneously, on a tax base that was shrinking by the day. And then came the third problem. Finland's labour market is one of the most organised in the developed world. Union density is among the highest in Europe. Wage agreements are negotiated at the sector level, covering entire industries in one contract cycle. Workers have strong protections, severance is generous, dismissal is difficult. During the Nokia boom years, this was a feature, not a problem. Workers captured a real share of corporate prosperity. Wages rose, living standards rose, the social contract held. When the economy needed to pivot fast, that same rigidity became a trap. Wages negotiated during boom years locked in cost structures that made Finnish companies uncompetitive almost overnight. The competitiveness gap with Germany and Sweden widened to roughly 20 percentage points in the years after the crisis. Finland could not cut its way out quickly because the labour law made rapid restructuring slow and expensive. It could not hire flexibly into new sectors because the wage floors in legacy industries pulled upward on the whole economy. The government did eventually push through a competitiveness pact in 2016 that effectively cut labour costs by about 4%. It worked, partially, but it took almost a decade of pain to get there. In 2024, Finnish labour unions initiated a 2-week strike in the paper and pulp sector alone, shutting down operations at UPM and Metsä Group facilities across the country. The same structural tension between labour protection and economic adaptability is still playing out right now. Strong unions built Finland's middle class. That is true and worth saying. They also made Finland slower to adapt than any economy facing a simultaneous collapse of 2 major industries could afford to be. The Finnish welfare state did not collapse when Nokia fell. Schools stayed open, hospitals kept running, pensions were paid. To anyone watching from outside, Finland looked fine. That was the point. The government pulled open a very large parachute made entirely of borrowed money. Finland's debt-to-GDP ratio in the years before the 2008 financial crisis sat at around 33%, one of the lowest in Europe, a genuine fiscal fortress. By 2024, that number had climbed to 82.5%. The Bank of Finland projects it will exceed 88% in 2025 and approach 93% by 2028. In a single generation, Finland went from one of the most fiscally conservative economies in the Eurozone to one running a structural deficit of over 4% of GDP year after year. The government's own Director General of Economics put it plainly in 2025. Even economic growth that is brisk compared to Finland's recent history will not be enough to stabilise indebtedness in the long term. Read that again. The best case scenario, the optimistic forecast, still does not fix the debt trajectory without additional reforms. To service and grow that debt, Finland raised its standard VAT rate to 25.5% in 2024, one of the highest in Europe. Cuts to social welfare programmes have been implemented, and still the deficit persists. The parachute slowed the fall, it did not stop it. And Finland is now carrying the full weight of that debt into one of the most difficult demographic environments in Europe. There is a number that sits behind every Finnish budget forecast, like a quiet alarm that nobody wants to acknowledge too loudly. Finland has one of the fastest ageing populations in Europe. The dependency ratio, the number of retirees and dependents relative to working age adults, is rising, and it is doing so at exactly the wrong moment. The welfare state Finland built was designed for a different demographic reality. It assumed a broad, growing working age base generating consistent tax revenue. That base is no longer growing. It is shrinking. The working age population only recently began increasing again, and that increase is almost entirely driven by immigration, which brings its own political friction in a country running strict amendments to immigration law. Pension expenditure is rising sharply. Healthcare costs for an ageing population are rising. The social security funds that once ran surpluses are under growing pressure. The Finnish government's own sustainability gap estimate sits at 1.5% of GDP, meaning the structural hole in public finances that cannot be closed by growth alone. The unemployment rate in 2025 is running at 9.5%, while the population is simultaneously aging out of the workforce. That is not a contradiction you want to live with. Fewer workers, more retirees, a welfare state that costs more each year, and a debt ratio heading toward levels Finland has not seen since the deep recession of the 1990s. Each of these pressures would be manageable in isolation. Finland is not dealing with them in isolation. It is dealing with all of them at once, on a foundation that was hollowed out by the one decision no one thought to question: building a modern economy around a single company. Nokia is not a Finnish story. It is a universal one. What Finland built was a world-class economy on a foundation with one load-bearing column. When that column cracked, everything above it shifted. The welfare state, the debt trajectory, the labour market, the regional economies, and the pension system. All of it was connected invisibly to the fortunes of a single company making mobile phones in Espoo. The lesson is not that Nokia was badly managed, though it arguably was. The lesson is that no national government should ever allow a single private company to become the financial engine of a sovereign economy. Not because corporations are bad, but because they are mortal. Industries change, technologies shift. The company that owns 40% of a global market can lose it in 5 years, as Nokia did, and a country with 5.5 million people has very limited tools to respond in real time. Now look at your own country. Ask which company, which sector, is currently doing what Nokia did for Finland. Which single firm accounts for a disproportionate share of exports, tax revenue and employment? For Ireland, it is American tech multinationals. For Denmark, it is increasingly Novo Nordisk alone. For South Korea, it is Samsung and a handful of chaebols. For the United Kingdom, financial services are in one city. The concentration risk is not a Finnish problem. It is everywhere. Finland just happened to find out first. If this video made you think differently about the economies you live in and invest in, subscribe and share it. The next video in this series takes that concentration risk argument somewhere you probably have not considered yet.